It wasn't the kind of job you looked for. It was the kind of job that found you, and when it did, you wished it hadn't. The recommendation came from Mark, a childhood friend whose judgment I trusted, mostly. He'd vouched for the Kingsleys, an eccentric but wealthy couple looking for a night nanny. "They're good people," he had insisted, though something about the way his voice dipped when he said it gave me pause. I should have listened to my gut then, but here's the thing about me. I never turned down a favor. Before we dive deeper, let me introduce myself. My name's Nathan. I'm 29, single, and still trying to figure out what the hell I'm doing with my life. I've been a caregiver on and off for years. It started as a side gig during college. I needed money, and taking care of kids seemed better than flipping burgers. Over time, it became my thing. I wasn't just good at it, I was great. Kids liked me, parents trusted me, and I took pride in being the calm in the chaos of other people's lives. But my own life? That was another story. If you're enjoying this story and want more chilling tales like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel for weekly horror stories that'll keep you up at night. Hit the bell icon to never miss an upload. Now back to the story. A favor for Mark. Mark and I had been close since we were kids, but our lives had taken different turns. He went into real estate and married his high school sweetheart. I bounced between cities and jobs, always restless. Still, we kept in touch, and when he called me out of the blue, I didn't hesitate to answer. "You still working with kids?" he asked. "Yeah, why?" "I've got a couple here in town who need help. They're loaded, Nate. They'll pay you a fortune just to sit around while their kid sleeps. It's easy money." Haydenfield wasn't exactly known for wealthy families, so his pitch surprised me. "Why me? Aren't there local babysitters or nannies?" They asked for someone reliable, someone I trust. "You're perfect for it." Something about the way he said trust felt off, but Mark had never steered me wrong before. Plus, I was between gigs and could use the cash. "All right," I said. "Give me their number." I met the Kingsleys the next evening. Their mansion sat on the edge of town, shrouded by towering oaks and ivy-covered gates. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a ghost story, a sprawling Victorian relic with turrets, gargoyles, and an air of oppressive silence. Mrs. Kingsley opened the door. She was tall and elegant, with sharp cheekbones and hair the color of fresh snow. Her smile was warm but didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Nathan," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Kingsley." "Please call me Eleanor," she replied, gesturing for me to come inside. The interior was even more unsettling than the exterior. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, like old coins. The furniture was antique, every surface gleaming with polish. Portraits of children hung on the walls, at least a dozen of them, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. Mr. Kingsley joined us in the parlor. He was shorter than his wife, with a wiry frame and a nervous energy that made him seem out of place in his own home. He shook my hand firmly but avoided my gaze. "We're so glad Mark recommended you," he said. "Finding good help these days is challenging." I nodded, sensing an unspoken tension between them. They led me to the nursery, a room that felt like stepping into another century. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a stained glass lamp shaped like a crescent moon. The cradle dominated the space, a massive, ornate piece carved from dark wood. Its intricate patterns seemed to ripple in the low light, forming shapes that were almost recognizable before slipping away. "This is where our son sleeps," Eleanor said, gesturing to the cradle. "Where's the baby now?" I asked, noticing it was empty. "With our day nanny," Mr. Kingsley replied quickly. "You'll meet him tonight." Before I could ask any more questions, Eleanor turned to me, her expression suddenly serious. "There are a few rules you'll need to follow while you're here." "Of course," I said, trying to sound professional. "First," she began, "you must never touch the cradle. Not under any circumstances." I blinked. "What if the baby needs?" "We'll show you how to tend to him without disturbing it," she interrupted. "Second," Mr. Kingsley added, "you must always stay within sight of the cradle. Even if the baby is quiet, even if you need to step away, find a way to keep it in your view." "And third," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "if the cradle begins to rock on its own, do not interfere. Let it finish." I stared at them, waiting for some indication that they were joking, but their faces were stone-cold serious. "Is this normal?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "It's for his safety," Mr. Kingsley said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "We're very protective of our son. You understand, don't you?" That night, I arrived at the mansion at 9 p.m., as instructed. The day nanny, a quiet man in his 50s, handed me the baby, a small, fragile-looking thing swaddled tightly in white. He barely spoke to me, just gave a curt nod before disappearing down the hall. The baby slept soundly in the cradle, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm. I settled into the armchair by the window, a book in hand to pass the time. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood settling. The baby didn't stir, and the cradle was still. But as the hours ticked by, the air grew heavier, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft creak, like wood bending under weight. I looked up from my book. The cradle was rocking. It moved slowly at first, then faster, the motion smooth and deliberate, as if an invisible hand was pushing it. My first instinct was to get up and stop it, but Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. "Do not interfere." I stayed rooted to my chair, watching as the cradle rocked itself to a standstill. The baby didn't wake, and the room fell silent again. By the time my shift ended, I was questioning everything. The cradle, the rules, the Kingsleys themselves. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I walked out of the house, the night nanny's words lingered in my mind. He had spoken them as he passed me in the hall, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you do, don't let it rock too long. It gets angry." I didn't sleep that day, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. But curiosity is a funny thing. It has a way of pulling you in, even when every instinct screams at you to walk away. And so, despite my better judgment, I showed up again the next night. The second night felt different from the moment I stepped into the house. The air was heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. Eleanor greeted me at the door, her sharp eyes studying me as if she could see through my skin. "I trust last night wasn't overwhelming?" she asked, her lips curling into a faint smile. I hesitated, then forced a polite nod. It was quiet. "Good," she said. "We expect the same tonight." Mr. Kingsley appeared behind her, handing me a freshly pressed uniform shirt. "You should wear this," he said, his voice clipped. "It's part of the arrangement." I took the shirt without question, but it felt unnecessary, almost ritualistic. They were trying to control every aspect of my presence here, and it made me uneasy. Eleanor handed me the baby, her touch lingering for a moment too long. "Remember the rules," she whispered, her tone a warning rather than a reminder. I nodded again, trying to keep my nerves in check. By the time I settled into the nursery, the baby was already asleep, swaddled tightly in the cradle. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. I kept my chair angled toward the cradle, making sure it was always in view. The stained glass lamp cast fractured patterns of light across the walls, giving the room an otherworldly glow. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I read a few chapters of a novel I'd brought, drank the coffee I'd packed, and listened to the rhythmic breathing of the baby. But around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The warm glow from the lamp seemed colder somehow, the air carrying a faint metallic scent, like the smell of pennies. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the oppressive silence. But my pulse quickened all the same. An hour later, the cradle began to rock. It started gently, almost imperceptibly, like it was swaying in response to a breeze. But the windows were closed, and the air was still. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The baby didn't stir, its tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. I thought back to Eleanor's warning, if the cradle begins to rock, let it finish. I wanted to follow her advice. I really did. But there was something deeply unnatural about the movement. It wasn't random, like an accident of gravity. It was deliberate, purposeful, like someone or something was pushing it. Before I realized what I was doing, I was out of my chair, my hand hovering over the cradle. The rocking stopped. The room fell silent, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the air turned cold, and a sound like distant laughter echoed faintly through the room. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering. I sat down quickly, my eyes glued to the cradle, afraid to look away. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd broken some unspoken rule, that I'd drawn attention to myself in a way I couldn't undo. When my shift ended, the day Nanny appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "You touched it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated. "I didn't move it. You shouldn't have done that," he interrupted, his tone almost panicked. "It doesn't like to be disturbed." "What doesn't like to be disturbed?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. He glanced at the cradle, then back at me, his eyes full of fear. "If you're smart, you won't come back." He didn't wait for a response, disappearing down the hall before I could press him further. By the third night, my curiosity had eclipsed my fear. Something was wrong with this house, this family, and especially this cradle. I had to know what. I arrived early, under the pretense of wanting to acclimate myself better to the routine. Eleanor seemed pleased but suspicious. "You're quite dedicated," she remarked, watching me closely as I settled in. "Just trying to do a good job," I replied, forcing a smile. Once they left, I took my chance to explore. The baby was asleep, and the cradle was motionless, so I slipped out of the nursery, leaving the door ajar. The house was vast and labyrinthine, its halls lined with heavy wooden doors and portraits of children. The children's faces were eerily similar, bright eyes, solemn expressions. But the dates on the frames spanned decades, far longer than a single generation. At the end of one hallway, I found a door slightly ajar. Inside was a small study, its walls lined with books bound in cracked leather. On the desk was a stack of photographs, yellowed with age. I picked one up. It showed a young boy standing beside the cradle, his face pale and unsmiling. I flipped it over, finding a date scrawled in faded ink, 1937. That couldn't be right. I shuffled through the stack, finding more photos of children, all posing with the same cradle. The dates ranged from the early 1900s to the present, yet none of the children looked older than 5. My stomach churned. What the hell was going on here? I returned to the nursery, my mind racing. The baby was still asleep, the cradle as still as I'd left it. But as the night wore on, the strange phenomena returned. The air grew cold, the faint scent of metal returning. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, too quick to catch. And then I heard it again. The whispering. It was louder this time, unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the room, but from the cradle itself. I stood, my legs trembling, and approached the cradle. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they became a cacophony of desperate voices. I looked down at the baby, but what I saw wasn't possible. The baby's face was gone, replaced by a swirling void of darkness. Within it, I saw countless eyes staring back at me, pleading, accusing. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an unnatural silence. The baby began to cry, its wail piercing and shrill. I rushed forward, my instincts taking over, but the cradle jerked violently, almost as if it was alive. And then I saw it, a small, ghostly hand reaching out from the shadows beneath the cradle. I bolted for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But as I reached the threshold, a voice, soft and childlike, whispered in my ear, "You can't save us." I turned, but the room was empty. When the Kingsleys arrived the next morning, I was waiting for them in the parlor. "I need answers," I said, my voice shaking. Eleanor's smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean. That cradle isn't normal. This house isn't normal. What the hell is going on here?" Mr. Kingsley stepped forward, his expression grim. "We told you to follow the rules." "And I did," I snapped. "But that thing, it's alive, isn't it?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You've seen too much," she said, her tone icy. "Perhaps this arrangement isn't working out." "Perhaps it isn't," I shot back. "But you owe me the truth." They exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. Then Eleanor smiled again, cold and calculated. "All in good time," she said. I left the house that morning, more determined than ever to uncover their secrets. But deep down, I knew the answers I was searching for wouldn't come without a cost, and I wasn't sure I was ready to pay it. The Kingsleys' cryptic response haunted me all day. Their evasiveness only confirmed what I already suspected. They were hiding something, and whatever it was, it centered on that cradle. I couldn't shake the image of the ghostly hand reaching out from beneath it, or the void where the baby's face should have been. The whisper, "You can't save us," echoed in my head, as if whoever had spoken those words was pleading with me to act. Against my better judgment, I made a decision. I wasn't just going back for my shift that night. I was going to find out the truth. The Kingsleys didn't seem surprised when I showed up that evening. Eleanor greeted me at the door as always, her polite smile concealing whatever calculations were running behind her sharp eyes. "Punctual, as always," she said. "We appreciate your commitment, Nathan." I forced a smile, just doing my job. The baby was already in the nursery when I arrived. It was asleep in the cradle, its tiny form rising and falling with soft, even breaths. Everything looked normal, at least at first glance. But the air felt different. The metallic tang was stronger now, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, more solid. I settled into the chair, feigning my usual routine. But inside, my nerves were taut, my senses on high alert. The hours crept by, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in my chest. Midnight came and went, and with it the usual strange occurrences. The air grew colder, the cradle rocked on its own, and the whispers began anew. But this time, I didn't stay in my chair. As the cradle rocked, I moved closer, my steps slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to ignore the fear clawing at my chest. The whispers grew louder as I approached, and I realized they weren't coming from the cradle itself, they were coming from beneath it. I crouched down, peering into the shadows beneath the ornate wooden frame. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, but then, as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Faces, dozens of them, their features twisted in anguish, pressed against the underside of the cradle as if trapped within the wood. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their eyes pleading. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. The whispers turned to a chorus of voices, overlapping in a cacophony of despair. "Help us!" they cried. "Free us!" I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But something stronger held me in place, a sense of duty, of responsibility. I had to do something. I pulled myself together and began to search the room. There had to be something, some explanation for what I'd seen. As I moved around the nursery, my foot caught on the edge of the rug. It shifted slightly, revealing a seam in the floorboards beneath. I knelt down, pulling the rug aside to uncover a small trapdoor. It was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. With enough force, I managed to pry it open. A cold draft wafted up from the dark hole, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. I hesitated, but the whispers urged me on. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and climbed down the narrow ladder, each rung creaking ominously under my weight. The space beneath the nursery was a small, stone-walled chamber. The air was damp and heavy, and the metallic scent was overpowering now. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object I recognized immediately. An identical cradle, smaller but carved with the same intricate patterns as the one upstairs. But this cradle was filled with something unnatural. Black tendrils writhed and coiled within it, pulsing like living veins. The tendrils seemed to radiate malice, their movements hypnotic and unsettling. I stepped closer, compelled by a mix of terror and curiosity. As I did, the whispers became words, clear and insistent. "Destroy it," they urged. "Free us." I reached out, my hand trembling, but the moment my fingers brushed the cradle, a searing pain shot through me. I staggered back, clutching my hand as the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around my arm. They were cold and slimy, their grip like iron. Panic surged through me as they began to pull me closer, but I fought back, yanking my arm free. The tendrils recoiled, and the cradle let out a sound that could only be described as a scream, high-pitched and inhuman. "Step away from it." The voice startled me, and I spun around to see Eleanor standing at the bottom of the ladder. Her calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You shouldn't have come down here," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "What is this?" I demanded, gesturing to the cradle. "What are you doing to these children?" Eleanor sighed, as if disappointed. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I snapped. She stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "The cradle is a vessel. It keeps our family alive. Generation after generation, it ensures our survival." "By trapping children's souls?" I asked, disgusted. "They're not trapped," she said, her tone defensive. "They're preserved, protected. Without them, the cradle would wither, and so would we." I stared at her, horrified. You're sacrificing children to keep yourselves alive? Eleanor's expression hardened. It's not a sacrifice. It's an honor. They become part of something greater. I backed away, my mind racing. This is sick. You can't keep doing this. Eleanor tilted her head, her smile returning. And what do you think you can do about it? The tendrils from the cradle began to stir again, reaching toward me. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the ladder, and swung it at the cradle. The impact shattered the pedestal, sending the cradle crashing to the ground. The tendrils wreathed violently, their movements frantic and chaotic. The whispers turned to screams, and the chamber began to shake. Eleanor lunged at me, her face contorted with rage. You fool! Do you have any idea what you've done? I dodged her, slamming the wood into the cradle again and again until the tendrils stopped moving. The moment the cradle was destroyed, the chamber fell silent. The oppressive air lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. Eleanor collapsed to the ground, her body aging rapidly before my eyes. Within seconds, she was little more than a withered husk. I climbed back up the ladder, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The nursery was quiet now, the cradle upstairs empty and still. I left the house without looking back. For days I couldn't shake the memories of what I'd seen. The faces beneath the cradle, the tendrils, Eleanor's final words, they haunted me. But as time passed, I began to feel a strange sense of peace. Whatever had been trapped in that house was gone now, freed from its prison. And yet sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear the faintest whisper, saying, "Thank you." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. What would you have done in this situation? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the rules exist for a reason.